welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, the Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops and Detroit Bad Boys, a former D1 Hooper, current high school coach, teacher, husband, and father of 3 amazing kids.
And I'm Omari Sanko for the second Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press.
And of course, we are always blessed to be joined by our producer, Wes Davenport. And today we have one of our favorite guests on the podcast, and we will introduce him in just a second. We gave him a heads up here. We usually like to bring our guests on right away, but we did have a couple new ratings and reviews. So from Apple Podcasts, Coach R-Dub says, best Piston podcast. Enjoy listening to Omari and Bryce each week. Very insightful and up-to-date analysis of the team. They stay positive, but aren't afraid to point out where improvements are needed. And then from John O. John O messaged me on Twitter, was like, hey, you guys are always talking about this. Where can I leave a rating and review? He listens on the Freep website in the embed. So he left it in the comment on there. John O says, this is a very informative podcast. Keep up the great work, guys. As always, Omari, I know you appreciate these just as much as I do.
And actually not this past week, the team was in Paris, but the last full week they were in America. I actually had a couple people at the arena that week say, hey, what's up, Omari? Listen to the pod. And it's funny because I get way more people who shout me out in real life from the pod than I do from my writing at the Free Press, which is funny since I've been doing that a lot longer, and says a lot about the state of journalism, which, I'm not saying is a negative. It's just funny for me, given that the beat writing thing is kind of my primary job, but we always appreciate it. We love the support we've gotten. I love the comments are always so detailed and point out specific things, which we like, and keep it coming. Review us on Apple. That's where we get most of it, but also feel free to DM or send an email. I think my email is in my Twitter bio. I don't know if you have one, Bryce, or Detroit Bad Boys, wherever. And, we see the feedback and we love interacting with you all.
One other thing, we are doing a special live recording on Sunday, January 29th, noon Eastern, first ever live recording of the Pistons Pulse. It's our 50th episode, so we want to do something special. You can find that on the Freep YouTube channel. So mark your calendars next Sunday, or this Sunday when you're listening to this, Sunday, January 29th, noon Eastern, live recording of the podcast. It'll still drop on Tuesday, but you can hop on with us, listen to the episode, drop comments, and ask questions as we're recording live, and we'll answer and interact with you. But let's get to what this episode is all about, because I think we have our favorite guest. I think this man has been on as a guest more than anybody else during my time hosting podcasts back to Motor City Hoops days. Keith Smith of Spot Track, of Celtics Blog, of one of my daily listens, the Front Office Show podcast, one of the best podcasts there is. This is our go-to for NBA salary cap, off-season, trade deadline, all of that stuff. Keith Smith, welcome back to the Pistons Pulse.
Thanks for having me, man. That's far too kind of an intro, but I'll take it. It's good. I'm going to play that for my mom and dad later today.
I love it. All right, let's get into this because we got a lot of questions and a lot of things to talk about. Here, we're just going to talk about the Pistons' overall strategy. So, Keith, give us a little bit of rundown of, the fan base knows where this team is right now, record-wise and all of that, but we're not going to talk specifically about Bojan and those guys until a little bit later. Are they a buyer? Are they a seller? Should they be conservative? How is this market shaping up for the Detroit Pistons at the trade deadline here in the next couple of weeks?
It would be disingenuous to say anything but a seller, but that doesn't mean you need to be a complete seller, if that makes sense. And if not, what I mean by that is you don't have to tear it all the way down to everybody that's not on a rookie scale. Contract's got to go. And I think that's sometimes where people go a little too far with this. It's pretty rare that you see a team go out there, especially in season, and make a series of deals where they're going to trade like 7 or 8 guys in season. It's just not that common to happen. And it's also kind of hard to do because there's only so many roster spots and all those sorts of things. So I think for the Pistons, I would look at it though as, an opportunistic seller. If a handful of the vets can be moved and you can get assets back, either young players under contract, draft picks, whatever it may be, you're just in asset collection mode now for a little bit. But it doesn't have to be, everybody who's been in the league for more than 15 minutes has got to be traded. And that's where I think some people are, at least from my wider angle lens, feel like they're landing.
Keith, and I've reported this, the Pistons are a seller, but as you alluded to, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sell everything off, right? Like you may have a yard sale, but if everything's super expensive, then you're probably not going to sell a whole lot, right? And that's
Yep.
kind of
Yeah, you put that price tag on the thing, hoping to bring it back into the house later because you know your wife hates it, made you put it out in the driveway, but you're like, I really, all right, $100 for that lamp that's worth probably $5 because I want to keep it. Yeah,
Yeah. All these baseball cards are $10,000.
Yep.
Like,
that's it. Yeah, man.
Nobody's going to buy one.
I want to get close to home because it's that might have happened here in the Smith house.
I should have picked a different example. Sorry about that, Keith. But I think the Pistons are in a unique spot where this is Troy Weaver's third year, and eventually you want to start winning. I think the Pistons would like to start winning sooner rather than later. This was supposed to be a step forward, maybe not a year where you truly make the playoffs, but you have Cade Cunningham and you have all these pieces that can help you compete, and then Cade gets hurt, and I think they're on pace to win fewer games than they won their first two seasons, which, if you're a fan, or, I'm sure the front office too probably didn't expect that. But I guess more philosophically is that, are the Pistons a team that maybe should look to sell? Do you kind of kick this can down the road a little bit? Or do you think when you have a guy like Bogey who's having an elite season as a scorer, Burks one of the best backups, it makes sense to just kind of hold these guys tight and make some decisions over the summer?
What I would want to do is really sit down and say, who is part of, if we have an opportunity next year, who is either going to be part of that team to be a good team next season, or who is part of a deal to get us someone who could push us into that. That's what you have to do versus just saying, all right, Alec Burks, Nerlens Noel, Bojan Bogdanović, these guys are all veterans. They all have to be traded. That's not necessarily the way forward all the time, right? Sometimes it is, all right, this guy could be a part of something because I, and you guys would know better than me. You're closer to it. But my belief coming in from what I was told was they intended to, hey, if we end up good this year, that's fine with us. We're not bottoming this thing out still. We've done that now. Now it was, if we can step forward, and then the injuries just kind of sunk things before they even had a chance to really fully get going. So now you pivot and you turn into, all right, well, what point do we have with some of these guys? Like I look at a guy like Alec Burks, really good, solid veteran guard, and he comes off the bench for Detroit. That's a luxury for a bad team. That's kind of like having a good closer on a bad baseball team. It's like, what's really the point of this? And if you can get, a nice young player or an interesting young player in some form of draft pick, I would probably consider something like that. I know we're not getting into specifics on certain guys just yet, but those are the kind of things I'd be looking at. I kind of sort of understand the Saddiq Bey stuff, and I have certain thoughts on him that I know are not popular in the overall internet sphere, as him as a player. But I feel like that seems a little odder to me. He's young. He's under team control. I'm not sure why it would be, really looking at moving him. But if they feel like, we've got better fits on the roster and other things, I know we spent a large chunk of the year coming off the bench, that, all right, I can kind of get behind that. But for the most part, I think it's look to move the veteran guys who may not have a place on this team the rest of this season or next season. And then if they go from there, you go from there. But wide scale, move everything, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And we will talk about Saddiq Bey, and I'm really interested to dive in that a little bit more in terms of what you think about him as a player and a possible market with him. So we will bring him up also. And we're going to talk about the NBA overall, the trade deadline, Keith Smith, but specifically, I don't know why I used your last name there. You're so famous. I got to use Keith Smith. I can't just say Keith. I apologize. We'll talk about the NBA overall at the deadline, but specifically to the Pistons, is this shaping up to be a good market if they did want to be sellers in terms of these veterans?
Yeah, big time sellers market right now. There's just there's only like 4 teams that are out of it, like fully out of it right now. So those 4 teams are really, they're putting asking prices that seem ridiculous on some of these guys. But when you look at it, it really is like, is it that ridiculous? Because, hey, and I'm just going to throw it out there, if Bogdanović is the best player available, well, somebody's going to want him. So get everything you can for him if you really want to move him. And that's perfectly fine. Even though it may seem kind of in a vacuum, it's like, wow, multiple first round picks. Like that seems kind of crazy for a guy in his 30s. Like that, I don't really get that. But where the league stands right now, he could be a guy who could tip a finals run, maybe even a title run for a team if they wanted to go trade for him. So that is where I really look at that kind of stuff. And I'm like, this is where the league is so different from the last few years, the combination of the play-in tournament and the flattening of the lottery odds has all but eliminated the, serious, egregious tanking. And I look at even the 4 teams that are really, out of it. We can say 5 if we want to put Orlando in that group too. San Antonio and Houston, I say they are naturally bad. They're just young. They're figuring it out. They were going to be bad teams all along. I think Detroit people were a little too high on them going into the season. I thought all the talk of they might be a play-in team. I couldn't get there, but I think they were going to be a bad team, but not a horrifically bad team. And then the injuries have turned them into a really bad team. And then Charlotte didn't intend to be this bad. Charlotte never intends to be like this. And it's just all fallen apart for them this year. So that's where, as I look at it, no one is full on. Now they might be tanking now, like LaMelo Ball's most recent ankle injury. That might turn into, he might be out for 3 weeks, right, with a sprained ankle. And that's where you kind of start to turn on the, all right, tanking is what it is. I could see Detroit getting back from Paris and saying, Bogdanović needs a couple days to recover from all the travel. Let's do that. I'm not saying they're going to, but those are the kind of things we're going to start seeing pop up here as we get, to and past the trade deadline. But then the play-in tournament, it's got everybody else still in it. They've got something to play for. And some of those teams, right or wrong, think, we get in the play-in tournament, we win that. Hey, we can make a run as a 7th or 8th seed, right? And that's where it's really changed things. Where 2 weeks, two and a half weeks as we record this from the trade deadline, you would have normally had 7 or 8 teams by now where it's like, all right, they're sellers. So what I tend to think, and this is a very long answer, a very simple question is, whoever becomes an early mover might really find a huge bang for their buck here. It may be a massive return for a couple of guys just by being an early mover. And I think that's something to really watch here. We're in a lot of noise out of Utah, who's hanging in there for maybe even making, the 6th seed still, saying, is that really what we want to do? And it's Danny Ainge, so you can never tell what he's got planned. But I think when you get into all that stuff, it's like, I think he knows, hey, if we're an early mover here, we may set the market price on some of these guys. And then we all know how it goes. You get to, 2:00 on trade deadline day, 2 Eastern, and it's like, all right, we can't get multiple first-round picks. How about one single protected first-round pick? And that's where, because then it becomes, all right, this is malpractice to keep this guy on the roster because he's got no place here. Let's just get what we can for him. So, if you move now, you might get the better return.
Keith, I think, and you alluded to it, just talking about sort of the different timeline for these teams. And Pistons were still in, I think me and Bryce both agreed, they probably were not going to be a playing team, but they would be feisty. And they have not been feisty. They've just been outright bad, largely because of decayed injury. But I think that positions them maybe a little bit more uniquely this offseason, where you can see them swinging either way. Like maybe we need to lay this rebuild out a few more years, or maybe we just strike now. We have a top 5 pick. We have Kate Cunningham coming back. We have some cap space. We have all these tools we can use to get better and actually basically do what Atlanta did back in 2020 before they went to Eastern Conference Finals, right? Like Trae Young's in his 3rd year, it's time for us to actually win some games. You also mentioned the market being hot, and the Pistons, they set that price for Bogut really high, and it makes it seem like they're probably not going to move him now unless the team decides to put all their chips in and say, hey, we're going to go for it. Do you think those types of packages could still be available this summer when the NBA hypothetically is still just as much of a bloodbath, just from a competition standpoint or a parity standpoint, and maybe you hold on to Bogey, you hold on to Burks? Do you think those types of deals will still be there this summer when the Pistons have more maneuverability and maybe could even leverage that further than they can right now?
Yeah, I think for some guys, for sure. I think for someone like Bogdanović, you can still probably get 2 firsts seems a little steep for me, but you could probably still get a first or a first in a young player or something like that. I think in the summer you could still get that. Burks, I think, becomes more of you've been doing this a long time, Omari, Bryce. You've been following the league forever. Everybody loves their roster in July, right? Everybody's like, we all got the guy we picked on our board was next guy on our board, no matter where you picked him, right? Like somehow, Scoot Henderson's going to be the top pick on the board for whoever lands number 2, even though it's like, really? You had him over Wembanyama? You bunch of liars, right? But it's just, that's just how it goes. And then everybody nails every trade, every signing. Like that guy was, a number 1 free agent target. It's like, really? He's your 4th point guard on a minimum deal. Like, fine if you like him. So that's where I think a guy like Burks or a guy like Noel, what happens with them is no one's going to be super hot on those guys because they're going to like, I kind of like my combo guard off the bench that I have already. Like, I don't feel a need. Whereas today, if you're a team that is like, we could make the finals run, but you know what we're missing? We're missing a combo guard off the bench. That gives him more value right now today than maybe it will over the summer, because over the summer, you're thinking, well, let's let this play out a little bit. The other thing you have to factor in is you then becomes your balance with Burks, Noel, Knox. Do we care more about having those guys as trade chips if you keep them past the trade deadline by opting into their team options, picking those up? Or would we rather just wipe those off the books, have the cap space, and move on that way? That's where that becomes that toss-up. And that's the conversation Troy Weaver, the Pistons, is his front office lieutenants, they all need to be sitting down and saying, all right, what are our plans, not just for the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, but what are our plans for the next 6 months with this roster? What are we really hoping to hit training camp 2023 with for this team? Because that's going to help you guide, all right, it's time to move on from some of these guys. Or, you know what, I think these guys can be a part of something because Cunningham gets back, a year of growth from the other kids. All right, we're all right. Like we get these guys back. We need a Burks. We need a Noel. We need that depth kind of piece, there for us. So that's the conversations you need to be having, because it sounds great to say, hey, the Pistons can have $1 billion in cap space, but what gets forgotten in that, you only get there if you wipe everything else away except for your guaranteed money. So that's where you're balancing all that out, because it's not going to be you get both. It's a very much an either or, and then it becomes, all right, when do we wipe that away? Now, or do we do it a few months down the line?
Looking even further down the line, Keith, some of these rookies, they're going to start needing extensions, whether they keep them. I know we just talked about Saddiq Bey. Killian Hayes is playing better. I'm not saying these are going to be massive deals. The Pistons, I think, according $50 million roughly could have this summer, but eventually some of that salary cap space is going to be taken up by their own guys. So what I've been wondering is, do they need to make this big move in the next season or two? Because eventually that cap space is going to be taken up by these rookie extensions. They need to spend this on an outside player so then they can use going over the cap to sign their rookie extensions. Am I thinking about the right way? And then also, how will this new CBA in the next couple of years play into that in terms of maybe opening up more and more cap space as that, it sounds like is going to grow?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer those in parts because it's two really good questions, but two very different questions, but they are related. So to your first part is, the way I look at team building is has to always be a concern. Unless you are a team that is 1-2 moves away from winning a championship, you have to be looking at a 3, 4, 5 year time horizon with this. And for a team like the Pistons, that's exactly what you're doing. You're looking at it as, all right, we only have a couple more years of Cade Cunningham on and I'm using this in very relative terms, cheap contract. But you have to also, you can't go too far with that, because the reality is Cade Cunningham is not Luka Doncic, where Doncic by this point in their similar career arcs, it was like, yep, he's the dude. We can build around him. That's it. I love Cade Cunningham. I think he's going to be very, very, very good. But I think your challenge comes with him is, if you're going to do that, if you're going to make the let's go get guys moves because we got to fill out the roster before he gets expensive, and then he doesn't get there, now all of a sudden it's like, cool, we just built a 41-win roster team, and we're going to be in the play-in tournament every year until we can clean this up. So if you're going to make those moves, you have to feel certain. Or Jaden Ivey needs to really pop, or whoever it is. You got to feel like I have that guy to fully build around. Otherwise, I think you take the approach of, let's just let it play out. Let's see. And if it turns into, hey, we can swipe player X from another team because they're ready to give up on him, or kind of like the Jeremy Grant situation a couple years ago. Wow, we got a free agent who we weren't fully expecting wanted to come here. Now he does. We've got that flexibility today to go grab that guy. This sounds weird, and I know people hate this because like, of course the cap guy says it this way. The best thing they have going for them right now is their flexibility. They can do all sorts of different things. And that's no knock on any of the players on the roster, but there's not a single guy on that roster who stands out as, yep, that's the dude. That guy's an all-star in a year or two. That's it. We've got that guy. There might be. I think Cade Cunningham has a real chance to get there. I think Jaden Ivey could get there too. I'm higher, I think, on Ivey. I think Jalen Duren, let's talk 3 years from now, like, just because there are so many flashes with him where it's like, holy cow, like, he's going to be something. And then he does stuff that it's like, yeah, he's super young. It's going to take a while for him to figure it out. But I think that's where I go with that flexibility part of it is like, all right, we're there. Like that's it. So I think that's what we have to be very cautious of. You cannot make those kind of, all right, let's build everything around Cade Cunningham all-star, unless you're really, really certain that's going to come to pass, because that's how you build a very average team, and that's where you get stuck in the middle. And nobody wants to be there, right? It's you either want to be bad or good. Like, it's just kind of how the NBA works. To the second part of your question, yes, the CBA is going to come in, new CBA. We're also going to have new TV contracts right on the heels of that. The cap is going to go up, 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 up. So what I have started to try to frame folks, and where we're doing this education over on Spot Track, like very regularly, is stop thinking in terms of $25 and $30 million contracts. Think of them in terms of percentage of the cap, because what you have to start thinking is player X worth 20% of my cap? If you think so, that's great. So today, 20% of that cap is, 24-ish million, 25 million. In a couple of years, 20% of the cap might be 30 million, 35 million. Like, that's just where it's going. We're going to be, we are very, very, very close to players signing 60 and $70 million a year contracts. I know that seems unfathomable and people can't wrap their heads around it, but we're not that far off already. We've got guys like Steph Curry and his extension. He's making well into the 50 million a year range. That's just where the cap is headed. So teams are going to start locking in. And what you can do today, next year, the year after that, those are the years to try and lock in guys at numbers that, wow, that number feels a little high today. But then a couple of years from now, when the cap pops up, it's like, oh man, that's, now that dude makes 10% of the cap and he's a near all-star player. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, that feels like a bargain. And I realize there's some people whose heads are spinning probably right now listening to this saying, how is $25 million a year a bargain? But that's where we're going. Like, that's just where we're headed in this sport. And there's no sign to increasing the roster sizes. There's probably expansion is going to come, but that's not going to change anything on individual player salaries. So that is where you really need to be focused on, it might seem a little off today, but look at those later out years and feel like, wow, that's where we're headed. All right, that deal doesn't seem as crazy to me as it might have otherwise.
And I think that'll be really important with extensions that may be coming for Isaiah Stewart, Saddiq Bey, Killian Hayes, because in the first year, those numbers may seem high, but then the rest of those contracts are going to be under the new CBA. And like you said, those percentages of the cap might look really, really good once that happens. We're going to go to a short break, and then we're going to dive into some of the players we've mentioned, Bojan Bogdanović, Alec Burks, Nerlens Noel, and even Saddiq Bey, and what their markets may be around the league, what the Pistons could be looking for and may be able to get. But Omari will lead us off with Bojan after this short break.
All right, we're back with segment 2, and we're going to dive right into the player forecast. So let's start off with a player who's probably been one of the hottest names on the market, Bojan Bogdanović. Just conversations I've had, I know the Pistons have set a very high price on him. I know they like his fit with the organization and are not at all opposed by any means to bringing him back, over the summer if nobody meets their asking price. I know they would like a really good first round pick for him, at least. For you, I guess, where are you hearing sort of the market for a guy like Bogey is, and where would you value him, just given how efficient he's been on offense for this Pistons team, a bad Pistons team at that?
So him as a player, he's awesome. And I don't think he gets enough appreciation for what he is, basically for almost his entire career. He has been really good. He can be your offensive engine. he can be your fourth guy. There are not very many players in the NBA who can fill both of those roles. A lot of those guys, you put them into that third, fourth player role, and they just kind of disappear, and they're not happy and all that. He's good. He's a good spot up guy. He's good playing away from the ball, or he's good with the ball in his hands as the kind of primary, offense creator. I think I continually shock people when they're like, yeah, but, is he really that good? And then they go look at his numbers. They look at the points per game, like, well, somebody has to score on a bad team. And then I'm like, yeah, now look at the shooting percentage. And then that's all of a sudden when you see, they're like, oh, all right. Like, okay. And then I'm like, now go beyond this year. Go look at like the last 5. He's basically the same dude. He just takes a few more shots this year. So it's not, and that's, even for me, that's a good sign that is, as his offense has scaled in volume, his efficiency has not changed. It's exactly where it is. It's slightly better this year. Like I keep telling people, he could turn in the most anonymous 50, 40, 90 season we've ever seen. And everybody would be like, wait, what? And then I kind of hope it happens, because I hope we're like, Bojan Bogdanović did what on a horrible pit? Like, how did that go down? Just because I think it would be a funny foot. And it's not where he's making a million unsustainable, contested 18-foot mid-range shots like Julius Randle a few years ago. This is like he's making good shots, the same kind of shots he's always kind of gotten in his career. So that's why if I'm Detroit, I'm 100%. All I keep hearing is, and I hear it mostly from frustrated teams that are like, they want 2 firsts for him. They want a first and a really good player. They're like, that's ridiculous, right? And I'm like, why? Who's as good as him on the market today? Now, the problem is if you hold on to that until 2:30 on Thursday on trade deadline day, it might be, all right, well, then you just keep him. But I think Detroit's going to say, fine. Then we're happy to keep him. We signed him to the extension. That extension was brilliant for 2 reasons. And I think the one is obvious of, well, you locked up the player, right? You have him. But I think what is gone missed is they gave up relatively nothing to get him, right? It was basically a salary swap is how I look at it. And now I've heard people be like, why do they feel like they should get picks when they didn't give up picks to get him? Well, because by signing him to that extension made him a far more valuable trade asset than he was prior, because now you're not trading for a pending, expiring player who may just leave after, a 2-month playoff run, may say, I'm out of here. Like, I don't want to be on this team anymore. So that's where I really look at this and I say, yeah, he's a great, value on that. And I know there's a little bit of a question age-wise, like it does feel a little off to be asking so much for him, but I don't know. I wouldn't move too far off my asking price if I was Detroit, because I really do think he's that good. And I think there's a place for him on whatever next year's team is. I think next year's team, not to get too far into that and go back to the first part is, I think the goal next year has to be, it's our step forward season. I'm not saying you got to be the Cavs and make a jump up to 4th or 5th in the conference, but you need to be pushing towards, all right, we're going to be in the 6 to 10 range, at least in the play-in. We're going to be really pushing towards that. And that's where we got to go, only because rebuilds lose patience very, very quickly. Both players, front office, ownership, and fans. And when you lose the patience in a rebuild, that's when you make silly mistakes and start to do really dumb stuff. So I think that's where, hey, you can keep him around, still have $40 million in cap space, and be perfectly fine to go, hey, let's add pieces around this, and we should be able to craft together a pretty good roster. So yeah, it's such a interesting spot to me, just because there's so many ways you can go with him.
And I also wanted to add that the second year of his extension is partially guaranteed.
Yeah.
For $2 million, which I think pushes it over the top of just an excellent value for the team.
That partial guarantee is like a joke. Like it's not even, it's so little that it's like, I mean, I'll take it if Bogdanović doesn't want it, right?
It's almost a team option.
Yeah, basically, yeah. It's so little that like the team's not even going to factor that into any analysis beyond. That's a year of team control we have that, is great. So now we've got 2 years of team control beyond whatever we get from him on a stretch run if you trade for him. So yeah, it's absolutely great, because again, he's a guy, if he does start to slow down in a couple of years, cool. So he transitions into a 6th, 7th man role, and you're fine with him for a couple of seasons beyond that. So and if he falls all the way off the ledge, like you said, Omari, you get out of that deal for nothing on that last year with, and you're just moving along with no worries.
I can't help but wonder if they want to trade him, I almost feel like right now is the time. Like this is because, like you said earlier, you get out in front of all this other stuff and we'll talk about this, but what if another team does fall off the map? What if the Raptors decide to blow this whole thing up? Well, now there's some other guys that are better than him. If Washington
all at the same position too, right? That's the other thing, that kind of big wing player. That's what you have to watch. And that's where, like I was talking to someone the other day and they're like, yeah, Charlotte is ready to start really listening on like Jalen McDaniels, and they'd love to move Hayward, obviously, and that's probably not happening in season. But the problem is everybody's like, if we do it now, do we do it too early and we didn't get enough of a return? But if we wait, does Toronto come in and be like, hey, who wants Gary Trent and OG Anunoby? Like, what are those? And now all of a sudden it's like, crap, suitors are off the table because they're looking at those guys. So that's where you're absolutely right on that, Bryce. It becomes where are you going with that? But it's Troy Weaver and crew are smart. They're not going to be rushed into something just out of fear. They'll do it the way they think is best.
And I think the Pistons are also aware of the fact that they got Bogey on such a good deal, and he's been so good on that deal that sure, you may sell high now, but given that you do want to try to be better next season, can you make a better use of that money and still feel what he gives you just from an elite scoring standpoint when he can be your number one or number two next to Cade and just take so much pressure off? It's like if you have a house in a market where everything exploded, right? And it's like, I can sell and you get way more than what I got it for, but you still need a house. You still have to go somewhere else.
Man, Omari's like hitting me right in the heart on this show because like we looked at we literally were like, it was like right on the heels of the pandemic. Like here, I live in Orlando, and it was like a huge hot market, and we were like, like we're home all the time. I'd like now we basically are here in the house. It's like I'd like a pool and like a nicer backyard and all that stuff. It's like, man, we could sell our house for quite a bit. But then it's like, and then every penny plus a whole bunch of pennies we don't have to buy the next place. So that's where where you're going into that point to bring it back around to the NBA. This free agent class is not great. It's another one where it's a little weak. It's really not super strong because of things like Bogdanović signing extensions, guys like him coming off the board. Some of that depth has come out. There are still good players, and there's going to be moves. But kind of, Bryce, I forgot that when you asked earlier about the overall landscape. I think the trade landscape is going to be big this summer because it's just anytime you have a lot of teams with cap space, and I project there to be about 9, maybe we could get to 10 or 11, 12 pending trade deadline moves. And it's not a great free agent class. That lends itself to a very busy trade market. And the league's wide open. We've got 10, 12 teams that I think, whether it's today or 6 months from now when we're in the off season, could be like, yeah, why not us? Like we can be in the mix with this. There's no former Golden State dynasty Warriors run looming over all this where it's like, well, it's Warriors Cavs and everybody else is hoping, they, all simultaneously decide to retire. Like, it's like, that's going to be what it is. That doesn't exist anymore. So that wide openness is going to add to player movement too.
And Bogey's also a great trade piece. I keep cutting you off, Bryce, but he's also a great trade piece because he's on a 1-year deal essentially after the season. So I think the Pistons look at that too, where it's like, if we have cap space, then we can make trades. And the Houston doesn't have a Bogey asset. San Antonio doesn't have a Bogey asset. Maybe that pushes us over the top. So I think logically it makes sense to trade him now, but it's also a chance to trade him now. And they look back at 5 years and it's like, maybe we should have just played it out and see what happened.
Well, what you don't want to be is, as you're taking that step forward season next year, you don't want to be sitting at this time a year from now saying, what we could really use? A Bojan Bogdanović type.
Yeah, exactly.
Because then it's like, oh, man, like we had him. Now, you hope that whatever the return is has helped you get there and, and it's got you set up for the future. But yeah, that is true. Like you do run into that as well.
So just to put a cap on Bogey before we move to Burks, I'm not going to ask you, I don't know, maybe you don't like predictions. I am going to ask you, if you don't want to do a prediction, don't do a prediction. But who do you think is the best fit for Bogdanović? And what would you guess a return could be if they moved him at the deadline? Because I like the idea of some sort of unprotected, maybe top 3 protected, but some sort of first round pick that's not super protected, and then a young prospect. That's where I would be. Where are you at? And what do you think, might realistically happen? Where does he fit really nice?
Yeah, you put me in a spot where I feel absolutely gross saying this as someone who grew up in Boston. It feels like it's the Lakers. Like it really does. Like it just feels like he would fill 25 needs for them. Like, it just feels that way with them. And if I was the Pistons, boy, I would love one of those picks unprotected down the line. Now, there's a chance because they're the Lakers, they're just because of where they are and they're the Lakers, they could turn it around by 27, 29 and be completely awesome. But there's also a chance they've bumbled their way into this is a mess post LeBron and they're back to like where they were a few years ago before LeBron went there, where it was like, what they have, like, they felt like they had the number 2 pick for like 4 years in a row. So it could be in that kind of situation. So I think when you get into that spot, that's where it really becomes, he fits so many things. And for Detroit's side, you're not going to get both of those picks, like not even with protections. You're not going to get them because it's too hard for them to protect those picks. But if you could get one of those picks, like unprotected, that starts to be like, all right, because you can also get enough in expiring salary that doesn't mess you up past this year. Because that's the other pieces, right? If I'm trading Bogdanović, I don't want anything coming back on my books that isn't attached to a kid on a rookie scale deal or a first year, undrafted second round pick deal. That's, interesting. I don't want any significant money going on my books if I move him too. So that's where I feel like he'd be absolutely the best fit, but he could play anywhere and fill a ton of needs. Memphis is another team. I think he would be amazing on the Grizzlies because he could either start at the 3, come off the bench for that team. They've got some kids. They could cobble together a deal and send to Detroit that starts to be, wow, that's kind of interesting now. Now we're kind of on something there. So I almost wonder, could that be a place where you would fit? But hey, at the expense of time, because I could go through, probably 14 other teams. I'm like, I like them there. If anything should come across clear, I'm a pretty big Bojan Bogdanović fan. I think he's a very good player on a very, very good contract.
Alec Burks. So we've talked about him a little bit, but his value is a little different, just given that he is in a bench role and maybe just the track record that Bogey has isn't quite there. But where would you value him? And especially with that team option worth $10 billion this summer, just how much does that put a wrinkle into his future value for the Pistons or maybe their decision making as well?
Yeah, he feels like a guy who should be somewhere else to me. Just because I feel like for the Pistons, that $10 million could be used better. Now you have to have the same evaluation process of a year from now. Do you want to be like, what we could use? We could use Alec Burks behind Cunningham and Ivy in our backcourt, because that gets tough. And what's really changed for me with Alec Burks is the last few years, this year he's shooting lights out. But the last couple of years before that, he was pretty good too. And he's always been a little bit more of a shaky shooter. I think his role right now is really good. Playing, he's combo guard off the bench, can let him run some stuff. He can play off the ball. He's, pretty good cutter. For a long time, I've been kind of like, he'd fit really good playing with Nikola Jokic. Like, just, he's a good cutter. He's a good passer, off of cuts. He can spot up. Like, he's just a good player all around. But I think where you go with that, if that conversation needs to be less about today, because fine, he's playing well, but what does that do? I don't think that does anything, right, for you if you're Detroit. Like, I'm not trying to win games now, like, and not that they're trying to lose, but like, it doesn't matter if he helps you to 4 more wins this year. Is that a good thing? I'm not entirely sure. But I think when you look at it with him next year, is he worth $10 million on our books? Or is he better off being on somebody else's team and we have $10 million in cap space? Again, any trade the Pistons make, and this will be the last time I say it, or not, we'll see. Just don't take on any money long term, right? Like, just, try to increase your flexibility even more, especially for guys who won't be on the books anyway. Like, you got to be really careful about that. So, yeah, it's interesting. Now, value-wise, you might be able to get a top 20 protected first if some team gets really, man, but we really need that. I think it sucks because nobody in Detroit is sitting there rooting for injuries around the league, but you better believe if a guard goes down on a contender, Detroit's probably going to make a call and say like, hey, it looks like you could use a guard. Like, what are you thinking? And then that's where, now all of a sudden that could go from being, all right, 2 seconds and maybe a interesting kid to, all right, we can get a protected first round pick out of this team. Like that could be something that happens.
So that's what they're looking at with Burks is a young, maybe not nearly as upside prospect or a couple second round picks, something like that. We're not talking first round type pick, at least not right now, unless, like you say, it's a team that just, hey, we're title contenders. We lost our seventh man, our best guard off the bench, and Burks is going to help make sure that we go and still compete for this title. Is there a team out there right now? Like off the top of my head, it doesn't seem like there's as obvious needs. I'm sure there are, but is there anybody that you had in mind that's like, man, this team is really missing, 12 to 15 point a night score off the bench?
Yeah, I think, Philly could use a guy like that. Maybe Milwaukee is a team. I think Brooklyn's depth after you get through the first couple is a little rough, but they've got a bunch of guards on that team. Cleveland's a little bit interesting, but they've got Rubio back now. If you look out west, I think, again, I mentioned him before, but I think Memphis could be kind of an interesting team for a guy like him. In a lot of ways, he's almost like the smaller version of Bogdanović, right? Where Bogdanović is in today's game, he's like a 3-4 who could also play as a big 2. Burks is like a 2-3 who can also play as like a big 1. So it's just like he's like one position slid down from that. So I feel like that is where those are the kind of teams you're looking at, right? The Kings, I think, could use a bigger guard off their bench. They wanted to make a move like that. The problem is them finding the matching value that's going to go the other way. And that's where you got to really dive into those rosters a little bit to say, because it's funny, we'll get, and I'm sure you guys get filled with these at this time of year where it's like, oh yeah, I saw you mentioned Alec Burks. You think we could get Keegan Murray for him from the Kings? And it's like, no, like that's not going to happen. Like we can't, let's not get silly about this stuff. Like, if you want to take back Terrence Davis and Alex Len is matching salary that's not on your books, and you in the Kings Plus set up with a some kind of draft capital, sure, like that could happen. But yeah, he's a guy who can fit again too, because he's not someone who's going to come in and is like, I have to start to be effective. Like he can come off your bench, he can play, there. I kind of look at he's kind of like a poor man's Malcolm Brogdon in a way, where it's like he can play a lot of different roles, and that's Brogdon's doing that excellently for Boston right now.
Yeah, and you don't have to move Burks to get off his contract, because you can get off his contract. If that's all you want to do, then you just keep him, you ride him out this season. The other thing that I think Troy Weaver does a really good job, unless Burke wants to move. I think Troy Weaver's done a good job. He moved Derrick Rose to New York and some of those things. So unless Burks just wanted out because the team's not near as good, but you don't have to move him for salary reasons, because it is a team option. And another guy that has a team option, and we'll talk about after this short break, is Nerlens Noel. We'll talk about him, any possible trade market for him, and maybe even some of the young guys. And we talked about Saddiq Bey a little bit earlier. We'll do all of that after we take a short break right here.
All right, we're back with segment 3, and let's get into a player that his name has popped up, and maybe he's a little bit more gettable than the other young players on the roster, but I'll still be very surprised to see him move. Saddiq Bey. He probably hasn't had the third season a lot of people wanted to see from him, and you alluded to some thoughts on Saddiq earlier that makes you trouble with Pistons fans, so we're not going to throw you to the wolves on this one.
Oh, that's okay. You can. They're probably going to say it anyway.
But I guess I'm just curious, with a guy like Saddiq, it's not too often you see players dealt before they get to that initial extension point or restricted free agency. Where do you kind of value him? And for a Pistons team that already has Bogey, kind of how does that alter your situation compared to past seasons as they go into the trade deadline and this offseason?
I think his potential still, even this deep, and I'm putting deep very much in quotation marks because it's not deep, but his potential of the Pistons is worth way more than they could ever reasonably get in a trade for him. And I'm not somebody saying like you need multiple firsts or I need a Keegan Murray kind of guy. Like that's going too far, but it doesn't make a ton of sense to me to trade him for even a top 20 protected first or just like another, that guy's kind of interesting. The forward line's a little bit crowded, but not so much so that I'd be worried about that at this point in their, team building horizon. I would keep him. Now, my issue with Saddiq Bey is, and trust me, like anytime his name comes up, I know I'm going to get a million Celtics fans being like, what about Saddiq Bey? Because one, his contract is so small, so it's very easily gettable for a team. And you could, drop him into trade exceptions and all sorts of stuff around the league. And my thing is, I don't know on a contender what hole he necessarily fills, because he's a guy who needs he needs the last, I don't know exactly how many games Detroit has left, but the last 30, 35 games, whatever it is on the season, to really explore the studio space. Let him kind of do his thing. I know that kind of happened last year and he dropped 50 on Orlando. So, it turns into, all right, well, that could be what happens. And I think my challenge is, the number one thing is people are like, well, he's big, he's a big wing and he can shoot. And I'm like, can he shoot? I'm not sold that he can. And people are like, yeah, he can shoot. And I'm like, well, if he can shoot, can he make? Because that's the important thing. Like, because, and you look at the numbers, they're not very good. And it's not just, my thing is, if you're a 3-point specialist that shoots 38% from 3 and 40% overall, that's fine, because then 90% of your shots are coming from 3. So I don't really care so much about your overall shooting percentage. But he's not that. He's not a 3-point specialist. So his shooting 35 to 38% from 3, but followed by 40% top end range from overall, that's not good. That tells me he can't finish. He can't get to the where he needs to be inside to his spots. Now, why I'm not out fully is maybe he just hasn't figured out where his spots are yet. And sometimes guys like him, who he was kind of, if I remember right, he was kind of an overpowering player in college. I wonder if he just hasn't learned the craft yet at the NBA game, where it's like, all right, I can't go through everybody here or over a bunch of guys. I got to develop a little more craft to my game. Like, I think I look at Cade Cunningham. Day one, he came in with a lot of craft in his scoring game. I was like, yeah, this kid just kind of knows how to get to his spots, get his looks up. Bey doesn't have that. It felt like he came in initially, he's like, I'm just going to bulldoze through guys. And I was like, oh, I can't do that. And then that turned into, well, I can't bulldoze through them, so I'll settle for a bunch of crappy step back 18-footers. And it's like, those are awful shots. Like, stop taking those. They look great when they go in a 50-point game, right? Then it's like, dude's on fire and he's in his bag, and all that stuff that gets said. And it's like, but then when it's, oh, wow, he went 3 for 15 and missed 10 mid-range jumpers that were semi-contested, it's like, yeah, and they were only semi-contested because teams want you taking those. So I'm in a weird place with him, where I just, anytime somebody's like, well, he can shoot. And I'm like, I'm not sure he can. It's like the Billy Bean quote, Moneyball. If he's a good hitter, why doesn't he hit good? Right? Like, if he's a good shooter, why doesn't he shoot good? Like, stop telling me he can shoot when everything I watch and every number I look at tells me he can't. But that's why for the Pistons, I would not move him, because these are the moves that get you fired. If you're Troy Weaver, you trade him, and in 2 years, all of a sudden, he's a key dude on a very good team. It's like, we had him for nothing. And to your point on the extension piece, that's the other thing people need to factor in with these guys. He's extension eligible this summer. So you're going to trade for him for 2 months and then initially go right into July with him saying, I want X for an extension. And you're going to have 2 months in your team to, all right, where do we really want to go with this extension talks? That's where it gets very tricky. So if I was Detroit, I'd just hang on to him unless somebody absolutely blew me away with a trade offer. And I just don't think that's coming.
Where he's at on his rookie deal, it doesn't make sense to move him until next year at the deadline, right? Because then that would be going into...
Even then, yeah.
Because then it would be like the qualifying... Like, that's whenever the Pistons traded for Marvin Bagley III, right? Like, whenever the next summer was going to be... The upcoming summer was going to be the qualifying offer and the end of the deal and all that. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think Omari and I try to be unbiased when we evaluate these guys. He's very sporadic with his play. Like, you just look at his game logs. He'll go 21, 28, 35, 6, 15. Like, it's just very up and down. And I think you make a good point. He's still kind of figuring out what his game is, and his role has changed. And then, a lot of times we talk about these guys as 3 and D players. Well, he also hasn't done the second part of that. Like, his defense is a little bit of a question, which this whole team's defense is a question. So, like, maybe that's
who he reminds me of a lot. I'm curious to see if you guys agree. He reminds me of young Tobias Harris, like Orlando Tobias Harris, where Tobias Harris, you'd look up and you'd be like, wow, Tobias Harris is an 18-point per game guy. but I was going to every single one of those games. He was an 18 point per game guy because he scored 28 one night and 8 the next.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's worse than just scoring 18 every night. I know people think that sounds nuts, but it's like you score 18 every night and your low end is 12 and your high end is 24. Teams are going to take that every single day over give me 28 one night and 6 the next because I don't know which guy I'm getting. And that's what Saddiq Bey, kind of similar, I think, on defense too. He's kind of a man without a position. Like he's not necessarily super quick enough to guard all the perimeter guys. He's not big enough to bang with all the bigs, but that doesn't mean he's out, right? Like he's still somebody you find a place for and figure it out.
Like you said, you would rather the Pistons find out whether it's truly there or not than somebody else. And I'm glad you brought that up. I actually had that on the outline last week and we didn't get to it, but I was interested. The philosophical idea behind somebody that can score 30 one night, but then 10 the next night, or somebody that's just going to give you 15 steady every night. And to me, in his role, it does seem to make sense. You would rather have the steady 15. Let's move on to Nerlens Noel. He also has a team option for next season. I've seen his name a little bit. I only scroll Twitter, so I don't know how much of this stuff is always true, but it does seem like teams, at least a few, are always looking for a backup big man. I don't know how playable he is in the playoffs. He's been good in very, very, very limited minutes with the Pistons this season when they've had to use him. Is there a market out there for Nerlens Noel? And if there is, what is it?
Yeah, it's called the buyout market, I think. I don't know who's giving anything of value, right? You would have to be at a spot where we absolutely need a 4th or 5th big, and we'll throw Detroit 2 second-round picks we don't care about. That's a team like Miami or Phoenix who just they're like, Miami is like, we'll pluck a dude undrafted off the street, developing him into a player. So I don't really care about having second-round picks. So if they were in, they're not in a spot where they need a guy like Noel. And then the other problem is, what I think he becomes a bigger part of is, hey, let's throw him in an Alec Burks deal where we can send you a $20 million player and we get the 2 of them and then off we go versus, hey, we're super interested in Nerlens Noel as a sole guy. I think for Detroit, you let that one go all the way to 259 on trade deadline day. And if somebody calls and says, hey, what about a single second? Yep. Schedule the trade call. Let's get in the queue before the buzzer rings here. And that's one where even if you don't get it, you're on the phone with his agent at 3:01. Hey, there was no trade. Buyout. Like, how much will you give back to set him free? And then some team will sign him, right? Some team will say, hey, we'll bring him in prorated minimum for the rest of the season, put him on our bench, see what it looks like, and go from there. And it's tough. It's weird because he gets me in trouble with Celtics fans because he's a Boston kid, right? So they've all wanted him forever on the Celtics. I mean, back to when it was like, Philly's going to move him. Like, why aren't the Celtics involved? Why aren't they going to get him? And I keep telling people, I'm like, well, he's not playing on bad teams. Like they're just like the problem is he has, what was it? Was it like a week ago? He was in the rotation when like none of the other bigs were healthy. And he showed out in a couple games and then looked pretty good. And it's like, and then that's great. But he's not in the rotation because Dwayne Casey and the rest of the Pistons know a ball leaving him in the rotation for the next week is going to be a bunch of games where he doesn't look very good. And now it's like, let's leave people thinking like, hey, remember that dude who blocked like 7 shots in a 2-game period? Like, that's the guy you want versus, hey, remember the guy who had 5 fouls in 12 minutes and, committed 4 bad turnovers? Like so let's leave it with that. But yeah, trade market for him, I got to imagine it's almost non-existent. But again, don't rush it, right? Just hang on to it. In this, he becomes an interesting test case for, do we want to have $9 million in trade capital this summer or $9 million in cap space this summer? For me, take the $9 million in cap space because you're going to have a bunch, but they've operated a little bit differently at times, in Detroit. So it starts to become a little bit of a, all right, I could kind of see it, but yeah, I don't think so. I just don't see any value, especially on that contract.
And I think Nerlens is a guy that, for some reason, the perception of the player he is and the player he actually is, there's a bit of a gap. There's, like, I know Bryce has seen it too. There's a lot of Pistons fans who are like, why is it Nerlens playing? Why is it Nerlens playing? This and that. And like you mentioned, it's you have a game where he puts on like this great defensive performance, but from game to game, he's probably not going to be that. You already have Jalen Duren, who's part of the future, and then he's injury prone as well. So you might get a few good weeks out of him, and then, he soreness or something, like he missed all the training camp in preseason, recovering from something this past summer. And I think those things kind of drag his value down as well. So if you get a second round pick for him, cool, but you need a championship team who thinks that he is going to make a difference in a title, and that's a very different question. He's more of a player you take a flyer on than somebody that you identify as being a true difference maker every single night.
Yeah, I had someone ask me, like, Detroit did the opposite, where it's like, hey, we'll take a flyer on Marvin Bagley, a year ago. And this is not that, right? He's enough older and he's got enough of a track record where you're more like, all right, I need to have somebody in case I have an injury in my front court or we hit foul trouble, in the playoffs or whatever it is, if it's like, all right, we're going to have to go against Jokic and we're going to pile up a bunch of fouls or Joel Embiid. And I need a fifth big that I can have, deep on my bench to throw in there. And it's like, I'll go back to, like, I get Celtics fans asking, I'm like, that's what Blake Griffin's doing for this team now. Like, you don't need another guy to do that. Yeah, if it was Rob Williams never made it back this year, then all right, we could have a different conversation and say, could you explore? But I think the other challenge is for contending teams, matching, $9 million in salary is not super easy either. Like, that starts to become all right, it's not a hard, but I'm probably giving you something I kind of like in my rotation. I think contending teams are like, it's not going to be there past the trade deadline anyway. So, why would I trade anything of value? Unless I just want to beat everybody in the market and I can. And so here's a second to do it. I just think teams will wait and just get them on the buyout market. And that should be the way Detroit plays it too. And even if you get nothing back in salary from him this year, that's fine. It doesn't matter. It's not like, it's not like, I mean, I think they're still like 600,000 under the cap anyway. So it's not like you're like trying to avoid the tax or anything like that. So, just set them free if you can't trade them and then move on.
One just general NBA trade deadline question here, Keith. Nope, I'm asking you two. Sorry, I always do this to you. I ask two questions at the same time. Is it going to be an exciting trade deadline? Like, what can we expect as NBA fans? And then two, give us the team that you think ends up becoming the surprise seller. Is it, someone like Utah, Chicago, Toronto, Atlanta, somebody else? So excitement, how busy is it in general? And then who's the team that I think is on our radars, but truly ends up, kind of blowing things up over the next couple of weeks?
I'm ever an optimist with this stuff. So I do think we will see some fun stuff. I think what we're going to see, though, is instead of, I know we all remember it was a few years back when Woj tweeted at like 301, good Lord. Like, that was all he tweeted because there was like 20 deals in the last like hour of the day. And it was like, holy crap, what happened? And like, we were still finding out about trade details at like 7 that night because it was like the queue was so long. I don't think we're going to get that. I do think what we're going to get is like, whoa, like, where did this come from? And because of that, I think it's going to be from a surprise team. It's probably not a surprise because I mentioned we've all been talking around it. That we're recording this on Sunday morning. The loss Toronto had to Boston last night. Jason Tatum didn't play. Marcus Smart and Rob Williams both left at halftime with injuries. Derek White couldn't finish the game. Celtics closed the game with Peyton Pritchard on the floor because they had to. And they beat them in Toronto. Like, that had to be, for me, the Masai Ujiri, I'm done. This team's not going anywhere. It's time. It is time to start something. And whether it starts today or we're laying the groundwork today for big trades in the summertime, which isn't quite as fun, but for the immediacy, that Raptors team is going to look drastically different going into next season. And I think there may be a let's go now on that. I also think Utah is going to do stuff. Utah might do moves, though, that are more, hey, we're going to trade veteran for interesting, decent young player, kind of keeps us in the playoff race for the rest of the year, and off we go. Kind of similar to what that Kings Pacers trade was a year ago, where it was, hey, we're just trying to trade for better fits. And I thought it was super unfair that the Kings got killed the way they did. I love Tyrese Halliburton too, but people started acting like Domantas Sabonis was like, random throw-in big man that stinks. And like, this guy was a 2-time All-Star and is really good. So I think we could see a trade like that with Utah, where it's like, hey, we traded Mike Conley, but we're also not completely giving up on the season either, but we're resetting a little bit to, rebalance our roster. I think those are the two teams I've kind of got my eye on. And because of that, I think it is going to be interesting. But unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be interesting until we're like in trade deadline week. I just think the lack of sellers and the fact that the sellers are saying, we want multiple picks. We want all this. I think that just has us in a position where it is like, all right, there just isn't a lot that can be done right now that, teams are ready to move. So I think, as weird as it sounds, I think this next week is going to be really, really big for teams to set where they're at and really decide, all right, is it worth still trying to pursue this? And how many of those teams are going to be like, well, what are we pursuing? A play-in spot? Like, why? Like, let's start moving on that. So that's where I think we'll get the interest from.
Omari, any general NBA questions before we let Keith go?
No, honestly, I think we touched on a lot. I just wanted to circle back a little bit. I just appreciated the Saddiq Bey, how you espouse on Saddiq Bey, because that's been another point of contention, and we actually talked about it sort of like last week. But bottom line is, I think this is probably shaping up to be a quieter deadline for the Pistons. There could always be surprises, but it seems like the main takeaway is that there is a lot of reason for them to go into next offseason to just put a nice bow on the pod. A lot of reason for them to maybe set this one a little bit quieter.
You know how it goes. It's you either love a player or you hate him, right? And it's like, I don't feel either way about him. Like, I like him. I think he's a pretty good player, but I'm kind of, all right, let's just be friends. Like, we don't need to be in a long-term relationship. It's okay if we check in on each other once in a while. That's kind of where I'm at with him. I wish him well, but, that's where I am.
Okay, we got to ask, because when we bring guests on, this is kind of the thing of the Pistons Pulse. We talk food over here, Keith, and one of the main ones is chips on sandwiches. I'm a hard pass and no. Omari seems to find that there's credibility in any combination of foods. Where do you lie with chips on sandwiches?
I like my crunch to come from the bread. Like,
okay.
Give me like a crusty bread, you were just in Paris, so I'm not trying to make a cheap joke, but like, give me like a nice baguette that's a little got a little crunch to the crust of it. Like, I'll take that. I don't necessarily like to throw chips in the mix, but I occasionally will, but I can only do it if it's like plain, like potato chips. Like, I don't want to throw like sour cream and onion chips into like a, ham sandwich. Like, that just, I'm a little weird. I'm still, I'm a grown man who still doesn't like my foods to really touch on my plate.
Perfect.
Like,
no, we are.
Weirdo, so,
not a weird. I don't find that weird at all, Keith. Like, my food is separated. I eat it one thing at a time. So me and you are right there with
I joke,
that.
I need the kid plate where it's like divided into sections, and I can put like stuff in there. Some stuff's okay, like we're having turkey and like mashed potatoes. Like, I don't mind those too touch, but like, I don't want gravy dripping onto my carrots and stuff. Like, no, none of that. That's let's keep all that separate and different. So, but then weirdly, I'm the kind of guy who, going back, I like bread, which is probably why I'm way what I do. I like the carbs too much, but man, I'll take a piece of bread and sop up whatever's left on the plate and eat that. Like, that's the best part of the meal sometimes.
Absolutely. All right, Keith, thank you so much for joining us, taking some time out of your day. I know you're doing pods all the time. Again, you're my favorite guest. I won't speak for Omari. I love when you join us. I hope we can get you back here, before the off season to break down everything that's happened and give a preview to that. Let everybody know where they can find you on Twitter, the podcast, all of that. And thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, you find me on Twitter at Keith Smith NBA. It's pretty easy. KeithSmith NBA. Be forewarned, I tweet a lot, especially during Boston games. But that's part of the gig for me. And then you can find my written work at Spot Track. If you're interested in Celtics specific coverage, Celtics blog is part of SB Nation. Yes, we are still around on SB Nation. Unlike unfortunately, so many of our brethren over there. And then if Bryce has mentioned it a couple times, my buddy Trevor Lane and I do the NBA front office show somewhere between 3 and 5 times a week. Kind of depends on our schedules and what's out there for news. We talk all the latest news and notes around the league. We will be doing a live trade deadline show. On that show, we'll go live probably around 1:30 or 2 and take you right through the deadline, a little bit after, reacting to everything in real time, and hopefully losing our minds over a couple massive trades that are went absolutely bonkers. But yeah, you can find all that work there. NBA front office show, YouTube, podcast, wherever you want to consume it.
Guys, I highly recommend the NBA front office show. Again, I listen to it. They talk about all the NBA teams, Detroit every once in a while. I know it's not the funnest team to talk about, but you guys definitely need to listen to that for salary cap, NBA stuff at large. Omari, take it away, my guy.
Yeah, Keith, always a pleasure having you on. Lots of great conversation today. And I mean, again, few people know the cap and just a conversation around the NBA as well as you do. So always a pleasure to have you on. And I do hope we can do it again going into the offseason when the Pistons should have top lottery odds and a lot to go for them. So again, big thanks to you, Keith. And I'll go ahead and close this out. Thanks to our editor, Robin Check, Sir Antoinette Delgado, and our sports editor, Kirkland Crawford. Also, shout out to Wes Davenport. We'll talk to you all next week.